If you have ever spent a late night hunched over a glowing screen, chasing the ghosts of your lineage, you know the feeling of hitting the wall. You find your great-grandfather in the 1900s census, a young man, perhaps a laborer in a city or a homesteader on a newly civilized plot of land. You find his parents in 1880, listed as children in a different state. But when you try to bridge that 20-year chasm, to see the moment the family shifted, the moment the land changed hands, the moment the old world died and the new system was born, you find nothing. It is a physical void in the ledger of humanity. In the United States, there is a 20-year silence that covers the most transformative era in modern history. It is known among genealogists as the Great Gap. Official history tells us this gap is a tragedy of circumstance, a series of unfortunate accidents involving pipes and sawdust. But when we look at the physical evidence, the timing of the legislation, and the systematic destruction of what remained, a different picture emerges. We aren't looking at a tragedy, we are looking at a forensic cleaning. Go to your attic, find an old family Bible, the kind bound in heavy leather, perhaps with a brass clasp. Look at the center pages where births and deaths were recorded in ink that has turned the color of rust. Notice the dates. Notice how often the handwriting changes right around the final decade of the 19th century. Notice the photographs from that era, those stiff, unsmiling faces staring out from a world that seems fundamentally different from our own. They are the last witnesses of a version of Earth that was about to be overwritten. In 1890, the population of the United States was 63 million people. Every single one of them was recorded by an enumerator who walked the streets, knocked on doors, and noted down the intimate details of their existence. And yet, for 99.9% of those people, the paper trail ends in smoke. Why is it that we can find records of tax payments from the Roman Empire or parish registers from the 1600s in England, but we cannot find the record of a man living in Ohio in 1890? It isn't just a loss of data. It is the erasure of the bridge. The official explanation for why you cannot find your family in 1890 is simple, practical, and on the surface, entirely believable. It is the kind of explanation designed to make you nod your head and stop asking questions. On the afternoon of January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Department of Commerce building in Washington, D.C., according to the standard history books. A janitor or a clerk left a smoking pipe near a pile of sawdust, or perhaps a stray spark ignited some loose papers in a non-fireproof storage area. The fire itself wasn't a towering inferno. It didn't consume the building. It was confined mostly to the basement, where the 1890 census schedules, the handwritten sheets containing the names, ages, and origins of 63 million people, were stored on pine shelves. The narrative continues. The fire didn't actually burn all the records. Instead, it was the water from the firemen's hoses that did the real damage. The records were soaked. They sat in a damp, dark basement for years, growing mold, disintegrating under the weight of their own neglect. They were moved from one warehouse to another, supposedly becoming a nuisance to the bureaucrats. By the early 1930s, the story goes, the records were in such bad shape that they were deemed unreadable. In 1932, following a routine inquiry, the Librarian of Congress sent a list of useless papers to be destroyed to the Bureau of the Census. On that list were the remains of the 1890 records. They were deemed no longer useful and beyond repair. In 1933, they were incinerated. It's a neat story. It fits our modern understanding of how things used to be, messy, flammable, and disorganized. We are told that back then, people didn't value data the way we do now. It was just paper. It was an accident of the pre-digital age. But as we peel back the layers of this accident, the physics of the event begin to defy logic. The Department of Commerce was not a barn. It was a center of government. And the records kept there were not just names. They were the legal titles of a nation's identity. Let's look at the numbers, because numbers, unlike narratives, have a weight that is hard to shift. In 1890, the population of the United States was approximately 63 million people. The census records for these 63 million were stored in the basement of the Commerce Building on specially constructed pine shelves. When the fire occurred in 1921, the records for 1790 through 1880 were stored in the same general area. They were made of the same paper. They were subjected to the same heat and the same water. And yet the records for 1790 are largely intact. The records for 1850, 1860, and 1880, the very years that documented the Civil War and the Reconstruction of the South, survived. Only the 1890 records were singled out by the flames. Out of the 62,979,766 people recorded in 1890, the government claims that only 6,160 names survived. That is a survival rate of 0.009%. Mathematically, this is an anomaly that borders on the impossible. For a random basement fire to perfectly excise one specific decade, while leaving the decades surrounding it relatively untouched, requires a level of precision that fire does not possess. But there is a deeper glitch. The 1890 census was the first automated census. It was the birth of big data. A man named Herman Hollerith, whose company would later become IBM, invented a tabulating machine specifically for the 1890 census. For the first time, people weren't just names on a page, they were holes punched into cards. These cards were the ancestors of the computer. The 1890 census was the most technologically advanced project in human history at that point. Why is it that we are told there were no copies? This is the most glaring glitch in the narrative. By the late 19th century, the United States was a sophisticated bureaucracy. For every other census, there were state-level copies, local abstracts, and secondary records. For 1890, we are told that due to change in administrative procedure, no duplicate sets were made. The system decided to put the entire record of a nation into one single, flammable basement with no backup, and then it caught fire. The 1890 census form was the most detailed ever created. It asked about home ownership, about debt, about physical disabilities, and about the civilized status of indigenous people. It was a complete ledger of the American soul at the turn of the century. It was a snapshot of who owned what and where they came from. And it is precisely this ledger that was allowed to rot. If you were trying to hide a massive transition of property or a change in the legal status of millions of people, you wouldn't just burn a few pages. You would wait for a fire to destroy the entire year. The destruction of the 1890 census wasn't just a 1921 event. It was a process that concluded in 1933. The date is the key. 1933 was the year the National Archives were being finalized. We were moving into an era of permanent, professional preservation. On February 21, 1933, just one day before the cornerstone of the National Archives building was laid, Congress authorized the final destruction of the 1890 census fragments. Think about the timing. At the very moment the United States was building a temple of history to protect its documents forever, it took a final, hurried step to incinerate the remains of the 1890 records. They didn't want them in the new building. They didn't want them under the new light. But why 1890? What was happening in that specific window of time that required a total reboot of the genealogical record? This was the decade of the Bureau of American Ethnology and the rise of the Smithsonian Institution as the official arbiter of history. This was the era when the mound builder narratives were being suppressed, when the physical evidence of what came before the frontier was being reclassified or moved into private basements. In 1893, the world's Columbian Exposition, the White City, was built in Chicago. It was a massive, ancient-looking city of white marble that appeared out of nowhere and was burned to the ground shortly after. History tells us it was all plaster and wood, a temporary set. But the 1890s was full of these temporary grand architectures that were systematically destroyed. By removing the 1890 census, the system achieved something remarkable. It broke the chain of title. In the 1880s, the world looked one way. By 1900, it was unrecognizable. The 1890 census was the bridge that showed how we got from A to B. Imagine you are trying to prove that your family owned a piece of land that was seized by a railroad or a mining company. Your proof is in the 1890 census, but the census is gone. You have the 1880 record showing your ancestors lived somewhere nearby, and you have the 1900 record showing they are now tenants or laborers. The moment of the theft happened in the gap. The 1890 fire wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system's final act of clearing the cache. It was the deletion of the receipt before the audit could begin. I am not suggesting a conspiracy of shadows. I am observing a pattern of law. To understand the 1890 erasure, we have to look at what else was happening in that specific decade. This wasn't just a period of growth. It was a period of total systemic recoding. It was the birth of the modern world as a managed corporation. First, consider the Dawes Act of 1887, which reached its full implementation in 1890. This act broke up tribal lands into small individual plots. It was a massive transfer of wealth, millions of acres, and a forced civilization of the indigenous population. Without the 1890 census, it is nearly impossible for many Native American families to track their lineage through this transition. The Great Gap effectively severed their legal claim to the land by deleting the record of their presence during the transition from tribal sovereignty to individual ownership. Second, the Homestead Act was reaching its fever pitch, but the 1890 census revealed a dark secret that the government didn't want highlighted. The land wasn't going to pioneer families. Modern data analysis of the surviving fragments and the agricultural schedules that miraculously survived suggests that up to 84% of the land didn't go to the little guy in overalls. It went to railroads, mining conglomerates, and land speculators. The 1890 census would have been a smoking gun, a physical proof that the American dream of the frontier was a corporate land grab. Third, look at the 1893 panic, the greatest economic depression the US had seen up to that point. Banks closed, railroads went bankrupt, and thousands of small farmers lost everything. This was the decade when people became labor. It was the era of the Great Strikes, the Pullman Strike, and the crushing of the populist movement. It was also the decade of the asylum. Across the country, massive, ornate, and terrifyingly large state hospitals and schools for the feeble-minded were being constructed. Thousands of people, the unfit, the vagrants, the widows, were being moved out of the 1880 neighborhoods and into these institutions. If you had the 1890 census, you could track where they went. You could see the names of the people who disappeared into the bricks and mortar of the new industrial state. Without it, they simply ceased to exist. They are names in 1880, and then they are ghosts. The 1890 census was a snapshot of a wild America that was being domesticated, institutionalized, and sold. It was the last record of an America that still had unclaimed spaces and unregistered people. When the work was done, the snapshot had to be destroyed. You don't keep the receipts once you've laundered the identity of a nation. We see this pattern in other places. The British Empire lost records during its decolonization. The Soviet archives have gaps during the purges. The 1890 census fire is the American version of this controlled forgetting. It is a bureaucratic reset. There is a smaller, even more mysterious wall that many people don't know about. In 1885, the federal government offered to pay for half the cost of any state that wanted to conduct a mid-decade census. Only a few states and territories took the offer: Colorado, Florida, Nebraska, and the territories of Dakota and New Mexico. Why only them, and why are those records so difficult to find today? These were the frontier zones. These were the places where the most intense reshaping of the land was occurring. In these 1885 records, we see names that don't appear in 1880 and are gone by 1900. We see a population in flux, people who were perhaps not supposed to be there according to the later narrative. The 1885 records that survive show a world that is messy. They show Spanish families in New Mexico who would later be classified as Mexican or other. They show miners who would later be erased from the history of peaceful expansion. The fact that the government encouraged a census in 1885, only to have the 1890 census destroyed 40 years later, suggests a system that was constantly trying to capture the data of the people, only to realize that the data was too dangerous to keep. We are told that the 1890 census was destroyed because it was useless. But data is never useless to a government. Data is the only thing that matters. The only reason to destroy data is if the data proves something you no longer want to be true. We often think of history as an additive process, a tower that gets taller with every generation. We assume that as time goes on, we know more about the past. But history is also a subtractive process. For every book written, 1,000 letters are burned. For every monument built, a dozen foundations are paved over. For every ancestor you find, there is another who has been systematically erased. The Great Gap of 1890 is more than just a frustration for people looking for their great-great-grandmothers. It is a reminder that our connection to the past is fragile, and that this fragility is often manufactured. Why are we comfortable with the idea that a cigarette and some water could erase the identity of 63 million people? Why do we accept that the records were lost as a final answer, rather than the start of a deeper investigation? The 1890s was the decade the old world was finally buried. The frontier was closed. The indigenous were catalogued and confined. The land was deeded to the banks. The white city was built and burned. And the people were reset. When you look at your family tree and see that blank space between 1880 and 1900, don't just see a missing name. See a deliberate silence. See the moment the system stopped being a servant of the people and started being their manager. Your ancestors were there. They had lives, they had land, they had stories that didn't fit the narrative of the 20th century. They were part of an America that was deemed no longer useful by the architects of our current reality. They were the last of the uncounted. Ask yourself, what else is buried under the sidewalks we walk on today? What other fires have been set to keep us from seeing the pattern? We are a civilization with a state-sponsored amnesia. We are told that our history is a straight line of progress, but the 1890 census is the proof that the line was broken, scrubbed, and restarted. Look into the void of 1890. Sometimes, the silence tells you more than the records ever could. Sometimes, the fact that a document is missing is the most important document of all.